So I'm part of Group 12, graduated school 2011 from Al Rajat School, which is a private school in Bahrain. Then I went to New York University Stern School of Business, where I double majored in econ and finance and did a minor in public policy and management. After I graduated, I moved back to Bahrain. I started working with Citi in Bahrain on the kind of Middle East, North Africa analyst program. I made analyst, senior analyst, and by the time I was associate, I was like, I need to kind of get a change of pace. I need to be exposed to other clients, other industries. So then I moved to London, also with Citi, covering kind of a wider, let's say, geographic area. So Middle East, North Africa, Italy, Ireland, and some UK industries. During COVID, let's say about a year ago, I was kind of thinking about what do I want to do next? And I knew I wanted to move away from kind of corporate investment banking and more towards like economic development. So I moved to Apicorp around a year ago, which is the development bank in the region. You can think of it as almost like a mini World Bank. We focus primarily on energy infrastructure, and kind of developing energy infrastructure, green and clean infrastructure in Middle East, North Africa. And I am based in Khabar. So that's an overview of my experience so far.
Thank you, Sarah. And next we have Khalid. Khalid Abkarim, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you, Ahmed and the Alumni Association for organizing this. I think these are like super great talks, especially during COVID, where we don't get to see all the different groups in more social settings. As Ahmed mentioned, my name is Khalid. I'm group 14. I graduated in Khartoum and then went straight to Penn. I was in the Huntsman program there, which is a dual degree between Wharton and the College of Arts and Sciences. During my junior year, I interned at BlackRock in the Financial Markets Advisory Group. BlackRock is, as a whole, is an asset manager. This is sort of the very small niche advisory group within it. I came back full-time after I finished after graduating, and I've been with them ever since. So I'm starting my 5th year now, I guess. We mainly work on public policy consulting as well. So we work primarily with central banks, ministries of finance, governments, on advisory related to financial matters. So sovereign debt, a bit of regulation, and a bit of portfolio advisory as well.
Thank you for that introduction, Khalid. And last but not least, Ilham Ali.
Good morning, everyone from California. I'm Ilham Ali, CPISPAA Group 11. I majored in international relations at Claremont McKenna College, which is in California. And I also did my master's in public health, specifically health policy and management at Columbia University in New York. I'm currently the lead design experience researcher at Aledade, which is a digital health startup, Series D. So if you're interested in the startup world, digital health, or just healthcare and public health, I'm the right person to talk to. I also had my own consulting firm for 9 years, where I worked with government agencies, enterprises and startups, including Tyson, Nestle, and a lot more.
Thank you very much, Ilham. So to kick off the panel discussion, I'd like to ask Khalid. Khalid, you talked about you studied economics in college, and now you kind of work in that field. Could you talk about your journey and how you decided to study economics? Did that have to do anything with what you wanted to do later on in your career, or is that something you figured out like along the way?
Yeah, so I think maybe the best way to go about this is I always looked up to my brother, and I think he had always been sort of the guidance I was getting. When I was thinking of what to study, I was always looking at sort of the career and then working my way backwards, which some might say is the right way to do it, others not so much, But basically, I decided to apply to a few universities in the US in the field. And then once I was accepted at Penn, the story from there pretty much takes its own direction. So the culture sort of at Penn is that, or specifically at Wharton, the business school, is that almost there's a path that's already been paved and almost everyone goes down that path. So it's either investment banking, consulting, and if you really want to stray away from that path, you're going into a startup or some of the tech companies on the West Coast. I wasn't exactly very sure what investment banking, what consulting, or what even asset management was when I joined, when I was in college. But it seemed like everyone around me was doing that. And naturally, you get into that herd mentality. If everyone else is doing it, then it must be the right thing to do. And I started recruiting, and I was I was applying to a lot of jobs which I didn't necessarily know what they were or what they involved. And then whatever I got an interview for, then I'd start the research. So even when I applied for the internship for my current job, I didn't exactly know what it involved. I thought the position in financial markets advisory sounded very, very interesting and very appealing, purely on a very superficial level. And then once I got the interview, I started reaching out to people who had actually either worked there or interviewed there. And I'm surprised I actually made it as far as I did, because I think if someone reached out and told me I applied to the job because it looks interesting, but I don't know what it entails, and now I'm reaching out to learn more about it, I think I'd get a pretty bad impression from that. But anyways, I went through the interview process there, and then again, the way most of these corporate internships work, and I think Sarah can also speak to this, is that there is the junior year internship, and that acts as a feeder for most of the full-time offers, and that's what I ended up doing. After finishing my internship during my junior year, I went full-time. So I think my story, most of it is one where the path was already, or the direction of travel was usually predetermined, and then you either go down that path or you sort of be the more adventurous one and stray away. I was not the more adventurous one, but that was it.
Cool. And Khalid, how did you manage to secure that internship in your junior year? You talked about networking. Is that something is done through college, or did you contact people outside college? How did that work for you?
Yeah, so a lot of the recruiting, at least back when I did it like 6 or 7 years ago now, Penn does have a very systematic and established on-campus recruiting season. Most of the companies will come to the universities. There's a resume drop before, there's like a networking or a career fair to begin with. And I think a lot of the universities that many of the people are on the call today will have something similar to that. They'll have a career fair, and then after that, there'll be on-campus interviews where the companies will come. The university will organize spaces for the interviews for first round. And then depending on how you progress through those, they'll invite you to New York or wherever the offices are for the super day. I'm sure it's changed a little bit now with COVID, but that was basically the process. But really, Ahmed mentioned that there is like a networking component to it. And I always think that's very important, having been on the flip side of that now and being on the reviewing end of resumes, we get like hundreds, if not thousands of resumes. It's very difficult to really just tell from a one-pager what's an interesting profile, what isn't. I really think that resumes sometimes unnecessarily reduce someone's profile to an education component and a professional experience component and a very small personal interest component. So I always encourage people to reach out to the alumni who work in the group or the company that they're at. Most of the time, those people are very keen to help, and they'll put you in contact with the right people. You'll be able to give a bit more about your personality or your background, and then you can even just ask that, hey, when you're going through the resume screen, can you just keep out an eye for my resume? And most of the time, people, just because you proactively reached out, will actually keep an eye out for your resume and sort of progress you to the next round.
Oh, thanks, Khalid. Thanks for the insights. That's really good. Let's talk about someone who took more of the adventurous way. I think that's a fair comment, Ilham. You didn't take a typical way starting your career. Could you talk about the what did you do during college to prepare you for your, I would say, entrepreneurship or your personal consulting agency that you created?
Yeah, absolutely. My route is super untraditional. I actually didn't know what to do in university. I was like, oh God, everybody knows what they want to do. And so for me, I actually did a lot of internships during university. And so not just every summer, actually, I worked during school. So I worked and studied at the same time. And that was a really important opportunity. I'm not sure if I was a fan of networking. I'm very introverted. I hate talking to people a lot of times. So all I did was schedule time to get to know people's stories. And so I got to know the career services office at my university very well and understood like what kind of internships and scholarships do they offer. So during the summers, I actually traveled a lot to East Africa, specifically Kenya, Uganda, India, and Panama, where I worked there in the scope of microfinance and international development. I was really interested in that as well as public health. But it was my second year of university where I started my own consulting firm. I did that because I wanted exposure to many different fields within social service as well as social justice. And that was like really the biggest impetus to launching my career path, where I did a lot of work for freelance as well as nonprofits, and it continued on today. But I did, after university, I continued my consulting firm, but I also went back to Bahrain and I worked for roughly a year and a half with the American Chamber of Commerce, working specifically in project management, but also working in relationship with US clients, but also Bahraini clients. So I really like that a lot. But to be honest, like the biggest thing that was really helpful was that I really pursued multiple interests at the same time. I didn't focus on one specialty in university. And that's very true till today. We found also from research that the most people who understand their niche and really dive into their passion are ones who have accepted different paths. And so that was, in a nutshell, like what I found out. After Bahrain and after working there, I did my master's, and that's where I dived deeper into public health and found a lot of networking jobs within my master's in Columbia University, and was able to work continuously here in the United States.
Great. So you would, is that a fair comment that for you to discover what you really like, you gotta try different things sometimes? So for you, you discovered it through your internship, you would say, more than your college majors and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I hated international relations and politics. I was like, oh God, this is so awful. I was like, I hate talking about politics. I care more about the human condition and what makes people tick. And this is why I'm in research and really understanding the human condition very well. And so it was my internships going abroad, but also in Bahrain, where I came back to internships here. And there was a lot of networking through the CPISP that I was able to understand, like, what am I really good at? And it was a very niche like area, which is in healthcare and public health. Not a lot of folks in the CPISP go into it, but I think the myriad of experiences about different worldviews allowed me to understand not myself better, but also what kind of value can I add to society better too.
Awesome, great. Now I just want to shift a little bit to, I want to ask Sarah, I was gonna say Sarah, but Sarah, as a like an undergrad, even in high school, like people or our teachers always ask us that, oh, if you want to get a good job, you got to get good grades. But just from the stories that I've listened to, like now from like Ilham, for example, that's not necessarily the key things that employers are looking for. You've worked in Bahrain, London, and now in Saudi. What's the you think the preparation that goes into a successful job application? What do the employers really look for in a resume?
Sure. So I would say I agree and disagree with the statement that you need to have good grades to get a good job. I, completely empathize with what Khalid went through. with recruiting in the financial services industry. I went to a very business-focused school as well. And the track was basically econ, finance, and if you're kind of a bit funky, you do marketing. So I think I can answer this from someone who has been through the process and as someone who, up until very recently, was heavily involved in recruiting. I would say that good grades, you can think of them as the thing that gets you your foot in the door, right? So it's a bare minimum requirement for these kinds of, let's say, quote unquote, exclusive internships or jobs where you'll have hundreds or thousands of applicants for just a handful of positions. So I can speak, for example, at Citi, you're talking about people applying globally, tens of thousands of applicants. For the most part, people's resumes actually get scanned through a system. It's just physically impossible for a person to go through all of these resumes. And once the bare minimum, let's say GPA requirements have been met and the system kind of determines that, then a human actually looks at those resumes. So by the time, for the most part, someone is looking at your resume, you have already kind of passed the bare minimum requirement of having good grades. Now, obviously, a 3.5 GPA and a 4.0 GPA are two very different things. But again, once you have your interview, the bare minimum requirements have already been met, and then it's up to you to distinguish yourself from the other candidates applying for this position. I think it's obviously a lot more competitive for internships or, let's say, first-year analysts, like really entry-level jobs, because what you really want to do is stand out. And for the most part, you have 2-3 interviews to kind of make it to the next round. So what I would say, my advice to focus on would be, yourself as a person, your leadership positions that you've held in college, any internships you've had. From my experience, recruiters or potential bosses have been very interested to hear about the Crown Prince's program, for example. You can talk about your personal interests. If there's an alumni connection between you and your interviewer, definitely bring that up as well. I would say this advice is maybe a bit more industry specific, but for the most part, finance and consulting, you'll have some sort of a, let's say, technical round where it's, very basic, walk me through a balance sheet, walk me through financial statements, do a case study, whatever it is. You really need to put a lot of work into getting the technical parts of the interview down because, again, you're talking about a small margin of error in these things. So you need to kind of have all of the basics down, and then you need to differentiate yourself by your personality. I'd say always make sure to have questions for your interviewer. And I think as someone who interviewed a lot of people for internships or first-year analyst programs, I think for me, the thing that was most important was actually personality. I think in banking and consulting and, let's say, these kinds of industries, maybe excluding obviously more specialized fields like medicine or engineering, you can learn almost everything on the job, right? So for me, as someone who will potentially be working with you, I want to make sure that I like you. I want to make sure that I can have a conversation with you. I want to make sure that you'll add, let's say, good vibes or a good culture to the team. So I think that's really something that you want to be able to get across in your interviews, is you just want to be someone likable. There's this thing called the airport test. I don't know if any, Khalid is nodding, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, me as an interviewer, I'm asking myself, would I mind being stuck with you in an airport for 5 hours? And if the answer is no, I'm not going to recommend you for the job. So just make sure to come off as like humble, curious, modest, and likable, and everything else should hopefully fall into place.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. What about it's interesting you bring up the culture and environment. A lot of people bring up, is your personality fit for that company culture? Can you talk about what do people mean when they say like you're fit for this culture of this company and not that company? What does that really mean?
Sure. So I think this is the kind of thing that if you're maybe applying to a bigger organization, you would have a bit more resources available at your disposal. So when I talk about company culture, I talk about kind of the things you think of on first glance. So, work-life balance, is it a very competitive culture, or is it more, let's say, communal or collegiate? Is it more individualistic, kind of every man for himself? Or if something goes wrong, does the whole team, let's say, take the hit? I think company culture is one of those things where, you know, there's a reason people do PhDs in it. It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint and describe accurately, but I think you can get a really good feel of company culture based on the conversations you're having with your interviewers. So this is something that I felt a lot when I was interviewing, both, you know, after I graduated from uni, and then when I was moving to London, and then again when I was moving, you know, back to the region. You know, you can kind of tell if your interviewer is someone that you would, for example, like to have a conversation with, right? So the airport test, you can think of it as working both ways. If I don't like the person who's interviewing me, if I think that they're maybe a bit, let's say, arrogant or competitive, and, you know, it's fine, these things happen, like companies have different cultures, it is what it is. That's, I think, the best way that you can get a feel for that.
Yeah, so it works both ways. I guess you have to like
Exactly.
the person and the person have to like you back.
Yes, it's like dating.
Exactly. Okay, so I will release a poll question to the audience just to get their opinion on when is the best time to plan your career. We saw Khalid that he planned it pretty early on, followed a typical path, but Ilham had the opposite. So I'm just curious, what do the audience think? Meanwhile, I just want to ask the three of you, starting with Khalid, how was the visa application when you're applying for a job abroad? And what difficulties did you face, and what resources do you use? Just for the scholars with us in the call that are or will go through the process.
Yeah, I think this is a super important consideration for everyone as they start to maybe narrow down or filter their search. So actually, when I was applying for my junior internship and then moving into full-time, that was around the same time that there was a change in the administration, which pretty much set the tone for a change in the immigration laws and how much flexibility there was there. So first things first, I would like, or at Penn, it was very clear to everyone on the on-campus recruiting website which positions were open to internationals and which weren't. So just like straight up, recruiting is a very time and effort intensive process. Don't bother with a company that from the get-go tells you they're not going to sponsor internationals. The process of getting a visa is expensive. It's a lottery system for a lot of the positions here. So it's almost understandable that some companies will not go through that process because it costs a lot of money for what is otherwise a gamble. And it's usually these very small companies that won't go through that process. If you go for the large companies, the big banks, the big consulting firms, more often than not, I think they still sponsor visas, but of course that changes. So for most people who are working, who are graduating from a US university, you can move on to OPT for either 1 year or 3 years after you graduate. There are ways to sort of game the system and like maximize your time. So for example, at Penn, they always let you do your internship on CPT, so that you protect that full year of OPT that you get. If you can move to a STEM major, or if you could take an additional course that will make you qualify as a STEM major, I would 100% recommend it, just so you get those 3 shots at the H-1B lottery. And then, of course, the H-1B is 2 rounds. You get your first 3 years and you go up for a renewal. So I wasn't a STEM major, but I was very fortunate that I did get my visa during my first lottery attempt, and then this year I went up for my renewal after that, and that just came through. So I think my advice would just be like, always check ahead of time which companies are actually willing to take on internationals. Focus your efforts there. Try to be strategic about how you can extend your time in the US before getting that H-1B, or if the H-1B doesn't come through the first time. Yeah.
Yeah, when you apply for the second time, what's the time difference? Like by how long would you need to extend your stay? You mean like going for a master's degree, for example, would be like an example of extending your stay?
For the visa or for the OPT?
OPT.
For OPT, I think it's just whether you're STEM or not STEM.
Okay.
But if you use some of your OPT during the internship, then you lose that from your full-time job. But if you can use your CPT for your internship, then you protect that whole year for your full-time job.
Okay.
Finance.
And just a follow-up question. So if you miss the lottery selection the first time, when is the next lottery that you can?
A year later. So yeah. So if you're not a STEM degree and you, like I wasn't a STEM degree, and you missed the lottery the first time, that's pretty much it. And that's the other reason that some companies are a bit hesitant to go into H-1B. Choose a big company with multiple offices. Like at BlackRock, it's such an established process at this point that if you are not a STEM major, you miss the lottery the first year, and they immediately tell you, okay, we're going to move you to the London office or to the Singapore office. In a company where they don't have other offices outside, it's way more difficult to sort of find you an alternative.
Okay. And for you, Ilham, how was the process?
Yeah, you're more likely to get sponsored, honestly, most of the time, if you have a master's degree than a bachelor's degree in the United States. And that is because you come with specialized experience and expertise. And that's what they look for typically. My experience is that it was really difficult getting, for example, permanent H-1B visa after bachelor's, even though a lot of companies have approached me. Like the Peace Corps is one of them, where I get to work in different countries in Africa for roughly 2.5 years, but that wasn't successful. It was only after I did my master's where I was offered an offer for an H-1B visa, but this was with an academic institution. So just to counter what Khalid said, you can actually work in very specific, like niche, small nonprofits will sponsor you if you bring really niche expertise. My expertise is in digital health and health informatics, but just be warned, you have to read very, very carefully, not only the laws of the country that you're in, but also the trends. Even though I didn't accept that offer from that academic institution, I knew where the political trends were going, and I knew it wasn't favorable for my industry and the niche expertise I was in. So I could already tell potentially my job would be eventually slashed in the next 2 years. And so that's something you have to be very careful about, but always get an immigration attorney. I'm not an attorney or a lawyer, so I cannot give you advice because this is a recorded session. But aside from that, just work a lot with your international coordinator at your university. They're very, very helpful, and they will help you a lot manage how do you navigate these laws.
And if you don't get the chance to work abroad right after college, I think we have Sarah with us who worked back in Bahrain after college, and then she transferred to London. Can you talk about that a bit, Sarah?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so I can't speak as much to the process of getting a visa right after college. I knew I kind of wanted to move back to the region, at least for a little bit. I applied pretty much exclusively to companies that had a global presence, a global footprint, very similar to what Khalid was saying, because I knew I wanted to keep that optionality of perhaps doing some time abroad. So when I moved to Bahrain, moved back to Bahrain with Citi, I kind of found out within the first few months that mobility is a very big priority, at least within kind of the HR culture of the company. They really want, and you'll find this with most international companies, by the way, they really want the juniors to move around. They really want the juniors to have a lot of exposure. And after a point, the messaging actually becomes, if you want to get promoted past a certain point, you need to do some time abroad. whether it's a rotation, whether it's moving abroad for a year or two, because I mean, think about it from their perspective. They cannot have someone like me having their entire career in City Bahrain, because then I will be specialized in only a handful of industries and a handful of companies. And it's almost a disservice to myself to basically continue covering the exact same clients for the rest of my career, right? So by the time I hit associate, I figured my job is kind of starting to become a bit more routine. I want to get a bit more exposure, you know, geographies, industries, types of clients. And I got approached to think about joining a team in London. So internally, it was a very similar interview process as it would have been if I was an external candidate. So I went through, I think, 6 or 7 rounds of interviews with basically everyone in the team. And it was, you know, between me and also another candidate who was looking to move internally. I ended up getting the job. Obviously, because I had been at City, they were willing to sponsor, but it did come with a different employment contract, different, let's say, clawback periods if I leave within a certain time. You know, obviously, very similar to the US, they're spending a lot of time and effort and money on moving you from point A to point B, and you shouldn't take it lightly. It's a very big opportunity to be able to move to a hub like London, or even in some cases, you had people moving to Dubai or New York. So it was almost like an, let's say, external hire. You know, new, you know, job offer, employment contract, whatever. But I would say if, you know, in the beginning, you might want to move back to the region, definitely consider moving somewhere that has offices internationally that you might be able to move to down the line, because it is definitely very valuable experience.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I think it is a good segue to move to our second section now. So we'll talk about the first 5 years after college. And here I want to start with Ilham. Ilham, you started your consultancy. Was it right after college? And can you talk about what prompted you to do that instead of like working at a big global company?
Sure. I started my company during university. So it was around the second year of college. And I did that because of 2 things. One, I valued freedom, creativity, independence over stability. Especially at a very young age, I had the privilege to risk take. And I'm at a point in my life I can still do that. And so that was one thing. And then the second thing, very similar to what Sarah said, I wanted to interview folks. And consulting is a really nice way to get a feel for your clients, working with them very short term, like 3 to 6 months maybe, but not necessarily committing to them yet. And this was really helpful because I worked with really, really big companies, and there were a lot of bureaucratic processes in them that I didn't like. And I worked with really small companies that had no workflows. And I found my sweet spot is working with government agencies, what we call civic tech here in the US, where you work in the intersection of innovation technology, but also serving governments to help them serve the public, essentially. And so that was, for me, like a lot of the interest really stemmed into eventually one specialty focus. And I hope that helps folks really understand that it's not necessarily one thing that you would need to commit your life, because your career ebbs and flows and it changes over time, and you change as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ilham. And then another thing I want to ask you, Ilham, you also went back to doing your master's after. So what made you, was that a predetermined decision for a while, or did you want to specialize into something? And so that's when you decided later on after you graduated that this is the right move for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because when I did my consulting firm for 9 years, I realized I wanted to specialize a lot in public health as well as digital health strategy. And one of the reasons to become a very important subject matter expert into that area is to have an advanced degree, which included a master's or even in the future, a doctoral program. And that's one of the core niches of advancing in the field, is knowing the actual trends as well as the market itself, but also having the degrees to support that. And so after taking some time after college, working, but also really understanding what I wanted to go, that was the right fit for me. But yet to say, I see a lot of people who have done their master's right after their bachelor's degree. I definitely do recommend take your time to get to know yourself as well as the area that you really want to make an impact.
And I think it really depends on what you're studying. Like for me, I did my master's immediately after my bachelor's, and that was because I started a research during my bachelor's degree that wasn't really finished, and I really wanted to complete it. So I continued doing my master's. And I think we see an example of that a lot more with people that are doing engineering and science. They would finish their bachelor's and then head to master's or do their PhDs. Because most of the knowledge you gain within your bachelor's degree, you don't want to lose it because the job market is not really into research. You would be doing more of an industrial work. So it really depends on different situations. Khalid, could you talk a little bit about your first, I guess now 5 years experience working with BlackRock? What was your impression at the beginning, and how did it change over time? And anything you learned or advice you wish to give to your younger self?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first few years of any sort of corporate job are pretty tough. I hate to describe it this way, but it's almost like a hazing process for a lot of people. They bring you in, it's a very steep curve. A lot of the work at the beginning isn't very fulfilling, whether you're in banking, whether in asset, or at least in my opinion. A lot of the work at the beginning can be grunt work, or just like some of the not so exciting tasks that you would have imagined you'd be doing coming out of college. I think one of my really good friends always used to describe his first year at one of the big investment banks as getting to know every single button on the copy machine very well and by heart. But it is, I think, coming out of that, your career is only what you make it out to be. And I think an advice I would give my first year self, my second year self, is that you need to be the champion of your own career and your own advocate at work. You need to plot sort of a development arc or path for yourself at work, and then you need to be very vocal about having the experiences to get you there. So at any point at work, so the system in my job is that we work on projects, and then there's almost a tendency that the longer you're on a project, the stickier you are in terms of staffing, and it's almost impossible to leave it if you're on it for a year or a year and a half. That unfortunately doesn't bode very well for your own personal development. The work becomes routine. You're not really picking up that much in terms of learning or in terms of technical knowledge. And that unfortunately happened to me during my first 2 years. You know, like as people started leaving the job, others started leaving the job, I was sort of sticking to the same projects just because I knew how the work was going on them. I think if I could go back, I would tell my junior self to be very vocal with my manager, with the staffers, when I felt like I had really gotten everything I could from any sort of experience, and be asked to move to something else sooner rather than later. I think the experience working for a big firm is great. You get some of the experiences that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But in 2019, we actually were hired by the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Finance, initially just for a 3-month period, to work on some of the public policy topics that they were working on. And that sort of slowly got extended from 3 months into 6 months into 2 years. And ironically, I don't think I would have had that experience if I was working in closer to the region. Actually, it's strange how I had to go so far out to come back much closer to home. But yeah, I think definitely like to to myself and to everyone, once you go into your job, think about, be selfish. Think about what you wanna, especially in a very structured internship program or analyst program. Think about where you see your development areas, what experiences you want to gain, and advocate for yourself. Ask to move to things that interest you. Ask to move to something challenging so you can learn it. And don't get too comfortable. It can be tempting in the first few years to just stick to what you know and just go with it and become sort of the expert early on. But I would encourage everyone to make sure they get the full breadth of experience that they can during the first few years, even if it means doing less sexy work or getting stuck with less interesting staffings or some of the more intense work.
Yeah, thanks, Khalid. And it's very interesting you say that, because Sarah talked about how she, after 2 or 3 years in Bahrain, she asked to go to London to get exposed to more industries and more clients. Sarah, anything you want to add to your what you've learned during your first 5 years, and any advice you want to give to scholars?
Yeah, but first I would like to echo basically everything Khalid said, and I would just like to add on to it that you really need to be honest with yourself about when you've hit your comfort zone. I think it's very easy to kind of be busy all day and, working, basically from when the sun is up till when the sun is down. And you think that you're super busy and you're learning a lot, but I mean, you've been doing the same thing for however many years. So being busy doesn't always mean that you're growing, and it doesn't always mean that you're learning. So I think it's a very important distinction, and it's something that only you can really tell yourself if you've hit that point. And I think it's really important to do, companies tend to do this and people tend to roll their eyes at it, but mid-year and year-end check-ins. So for me, I usually tend to every 6 months kind of evaluate what's the kind of work that I'm doing. Am I happy with the work? Am I happy with the job? Am I happy with the company? Is there something else I want to be working on? So for example, the company I'm at the moment, I'm one of the very few non-engineers in my team. So I have a finance background, and most of my colleagues are petroleum or chemical engineers who have kind of learned finance later on. So I'm, very honest with myself, and I know that this is probably one of my, let's say weaknesses or things that I need to work on. So it's fine if you have something that you know that you need to work on. Just work on it. Don't just keep telling yourself you're going to work on it and then never get it done. I think it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day that you don't really take a long-term view of your career. And by not taking a long-term view of your career, you're doing yourself a disservice, because then you're just going to be stuck. And I would also add on to that, just one more thing. I think it's so important to find and have good mentors. I think for me, I am still in touch with 2 seniors from my first job, who at this point, they're more like friends or older siblings, I would say, than, formally mentors. But it's really important to have people in your life who like you and want the best for you and have, let's say, more knowledge and experience and have a longer term view of your career path than you do. Really try to keep those connections going. And even if it's just a happy birthday message or a Eid Mubarak message whenever it comes up, it's really important to have these mentors. It's very fulfilling. And if the time comes, it's also very fulfilling for you to be a mentor to someone as well. So I think that's my extra 2 cents.
Thanks, Sarah. I think this is a good segue to our last section of this session. So Sarah, how do you plan your, I guess, professional goals or career goals? Or how frequently do you review what you've done? Can you give us like an idea of how do you stay on top of that to make sure you're developing, learning, and all? Yeah.
Sure. So I actually take, again, you'll usually see this within kind of larger banks or companies where they have a very formal mid and year-end review process or policy in place. I take it quite seriously. So every 6 months, I look at basically all of the projects and transactions I've worked on in the past 6 months. So my job is, we like to joke and say it's almost like a factory. You're just churning out deals one after the other, and then when the deal is done, you hand it over to another team. So I really take stock of basically everything I've worked on. Is there stuff, grunt work that I maybe don't want to be working on that I can hand over to someone else? Every year I'll have a conversation with my manager about maybe courses I'm interested in taking, trainings I want to go on. I think at City, they were a lot more structured about this. So at City, they kind of work with you and tell you, for example, you might want to work on your negotiation skills. So we're going to send you to this negotiation consultant, and this is kind of part of your training for the year. At Apicorp, it's a bit more self-led. So I've kind of identified courses that I want to do or trainings that I want to go on. And I also am very frank with my manager. And for example, I'll tell him, I did too many utilities projects. I'm kind of sick of it. I want to do some renewables. I need to learn more. I think it's also, as much as I can, I'll have, let's say we finished a call with a client. I'll see if my manager has 5 minutes. I'll be like, hey, how did you think that went? Was there something I could have done better? Was there a way I could have presented it, let's say, in a more professional way, let's say. And I think that's where it's really important to have good working relationships with your managers, because they will give you feedback, solicited or unsolicited, as required. But if your manager doesn't like you, they'll just tell you, go away, don't talk to me. So like Khalid said, it's really important to kind of advocate for yourself, because no one is going to advocate for you. You really need to be the one to take ownership of your career.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that detailed answer, Sarah. I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box, and or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. Okay, I want to ask the same. I'm just curious. I want to ask the same questions to the other panels to see how different people plan their goals and developments, and maybe talk about what is the your daily routine and basically how your plan breaks down into your daily routine. We'll start with Khalid and then we'll go with Ilham, or the other way around. It's up to you guys.
Ladies first,
Sure.
Ilham, please.
Thanks. I'll give 3 advice, and then I'll give you a typical day, what it looks like. First advice, very similar to what Sarah mentioned, is I have a board of directors of people that I actually keep in contact in terms of what kind of information as well as opportunities that I need to improve on, my strengths and weaknesses. So I keep a list of an Excel sheet of all the people that I've met, as well as when did I meet them, what are their anniversaries or dates that are important to them, do they have kids, any birthdays, etc. And I make sure I have a newsletter that I send out monthly to my network. And so they're aware of like, what is my progress? What am I doing? How can they be involved? How can I add value to them as much as they add value to me? And so you're as strong as the community that you surround yourself with. Number 2 is I always make sure to keep an audit of not necessarily just my skills, but also how my personality and my character changes. So I'll add in the chat 2 resources that I found really helpful. One of them is called Ikigai, which is a Japanese concept of really understanding 4 facets of your domain, of your character, like your passion, your personality, what are things that really excite you. And then the second one is called the Wheel of Life. It helps you assess 12 domains of your life, like your health, mental health, as well as your physical health, and etc. And I think often we don't talk a lot in the Arab world about mental health, which is really making sure that you're not always part of the hustle culture, that you always have to do something, exactly what Sarah mentioned, that it's okay to be still. It's okay to pause and evaluate where you are. The third part is taking an audit of your skills and where you really fit in within the ecosystem of the industry that you're interested in or the market you're trying to serve in. And that's something that you can do easily with sets of intentions as well as SMART goals, if you haven't heard about that. A typical day on my end is I work virtually from home 24/7. And so I actually don't have an office to go to. And this is very common now in the United States because of the pandemic, but also I've been working from home for the past 5 to 6 years. And so a typical day for me would be a lot of strategy with my team. I lead a lot of research in the United States for over 50 plus hospitals as well as community centers. And that also entails doing a lot of work in research, really understand the user experience of how products and services are being used, but also coming at the end of the day, working with design teams to create the best experience for patients, as well as physicians and healthcare providers. Khalid, how about you?
I like the way Ilham gave the structure, so I think I'm going to steal that from you. I think I want to echo what Sarah said about taking a long-term view and then how that flows into your day-to-day. I totally think it's okay for people to go into a job not knowing what it entails or whether it's what they really want or whether they like it. Maybe I'm just saying that because that's what I did, but as long as you're learning in a job, I think that's fine, or that's great, not just fine. So if once you feel like you're thinking about pivoting or whether you want to change, start to make your plans about how you're going to reach from that to that goal. Plot out your incremental milestones, set deadlines for yourself, and work towards them. So whether that's moving into a new industry and needing to do the technical studying that Sarah's talking about, carve out time in your day to study, to go through case prep, to go through interview prep. Whether it's wanting to go to grad school, carve out time to study for whatever the LSATs, the GMATs, the GREs, or whatever you need to take. Or if it's changing geographies, then again, do that interview prep, carve out time for the networking. So have a long-term or at least medium-term view of what your next step is and work that into your day-to-day routine. So for me, just to sort of juxtapose what Ilham said, we're actually, we've received in true New York fashion, much more stern direction to head back to the office. I'm going back right now 3 days a week, sometimes 3 days on average, sometimes more, sometimes less, with the expectation that we'll be back close to full time in the fall. We'll see how that goes with the new wave. Usually in the morning, we're having calls with either our EMEA team or some of our India teams to sort of hand off what's been happening overnight. You'll have a couple of client calls in the morning, and then unfortunately, most of the day is eaten up by internal or external calls that you start picking up the production work in the late afternoon or in the evenings. Most people are pretty good about carving out time for either dinner. Some of the seniors will carve out that time to spend time with the family. And then, you as a junior, use that opportunity to carve out time for the stuff I spoke about earlier. Interview prep, graduate school prep, networking. And that's pretty much, my day-to-day without getting into the boring details of it.
And nothing boring about your job, Khalid.
No, not as exciting as visiting the sites. What you do,
The refinery.
Yeah.
Okay, just before we end, Ilham, just because, so what advice do you have for people that are deciding to go the entrepreneurship path? It's not, obviously it's a tough path to go through to start with. So what kind of personalities or mindset should people that consider that path should have before pursuing it?
Sure. As you can all tell, I love the number 3. So I always say things in threes. So the first thing is have credibility in the evidence of your work. So when I started, I kept a portfolio as well as a website of all of the past case studies that I've done with clients. And it was a good reference point and an anchor for new clients to be able to see what have I done, what kind of work I've done, but also was a good starting point for that. And number 2 is one important mindset is to have a growth mindset. Some of you might have heard about this, is the capacity to learn and adapt and grow as you learn. And for me, I've taken multiple different types of positions with clients. I was once a project manager and more so as a researcher, and so was able to adapt very quickly. But the third and most important thing is having a really warm and authentic personality. People really care that you care about them. A lot of the times in consulting, it's a very emotional process. People usually came to me when their projects were failing, their businesses were about to fail, or even big corporations just feel that they're overwhelmed, they don't have the budget. So they hire people like me to not just clean up the mess, but also help create a thread for sustainability for future teams. Know that this is not just an emotional process, it's also an emotional mindset for whoever you work with. Just like in interviewing, it's an emotional decision making that people want to work with you and be stuck with you in an airport for 5 hours, but it's also an emotional decision for you. Do you really want to stay in a company that really doesn't value you, that doesn't give you the good benefits of vacation and time off that you care about? And so I learned that very quickly early on, that I had to adapt those emotional responses and be intuitive in terms of what people need, what they didn't need. And that was really key to my success for leading my company.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Ilham. And it seems like we're not having any questions from the audience. So I think this is a good time yeah, go ahead, Farouk.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, hello. It's very nice to see you again, Mr. Ahmed. My name is Farouk. I was actually part of the Crown Prince 21st group. So you came in to talk to us, and I believe someone else was with you as well. Unfortunately, I do not remember his name.
That's okay.
He was a really bubbly person. He was really excited to be there.
No, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, so my question is, right now with the pandemic, it's becoming quite difficult to kind of find opportunities because everything is less, in the sense there's less opportunities to do things and to go out. So now that everything's transferring online, how do you think it impacts students that are applying online? Like, should we apply for more things? Should we be more specific and more persistent on one opportunity? What's the strategy here?
Is your question to a specific person? I think I'll start.
Whoever is more fit to answer, because I'm not sure that's the thing.
I think with every crisis comes like some disadvantages, like you mentioned, but it comes opportunities, like we talked about. Now, with the pandemic, people are used to work online more, and so you can work remotely basically from anywhere. So I personally, I haven't been looking at the job market as much, so I can't really speak to. I'm not sure about the number of jobs that have been creating or that people have lost, what kind of jobs those were. But I can say that the opportunities of doing work online by yourself have probably increased with the pandemic. And maybe Khalid, Ilham, Sarah can add to that.
Yeah, I just have a couple of things to add to that, Farouk. So I actually started looking for a new job March 2020. So I kind of started the interview process, and then the world fell apart. And then a few months later, I ended up getting the job that I wanted. I think the first thing I would say is that now, I don't know if this existed before, but now it's very prominent, is that on LinkedIn, you can now filter by remote opportunities or work from anywhere opportunities. Some of the opportunities I've seen, require you to maybe go to another country for 2 weeks a year. So just keep in mind that, like Ahmed said, there are a lot more opportunities open to you now. That's the first thing. The second thing, I know we've touched on this already, but this is where your network really comes into play. So there are opportunities, let's say in the region, in Bahrain, and probably wherever you're looking to live, but you need to reach out to your contacts or people you've met through internships, even if it's, family, friends, the emails that you get from the scholarship program. I think in this kind of a situation, it does help to know someone at the organization that you would want to join, because there's a lot of applicants for very similar jobs. So this is where ideally your networking would really come in handy.
I'll give you a different strategy. to complement, but also to juxtapose. So I work with a lot of students and mentor them in public health. This, to be honest, this is a job market for senior folks. So that means whoever has like 5+ years of experience, this is a really good market to favor them. Now, what if you don't have 5 years of experience or you just have internships? What do you do? So there's this concept called mirroring in psychology. Essentially, you want to take keywords in your CV and in your resume and make sure that it aligns with trends in the market. So let's just say you've done an internship or practicum in the summer, and your internship is an analyst, and that means that you've analyzed some data for this firm. Instead of putting you as an intern, you can say, I'm a junior analyst. And follow the script of problem, action, and result, which is what we call PAR, very common here in the United States to align your sentences, and to highlight that you do have experiences that even goes beyond and past even your college years. So your internships do count as work experiences. So you can add that to the clock to say, like, I have 2 to 3 years plus experience in, for example, banking, and I bring experience in X, Y, and Z, so that you position yourself in a market that also competes with medium level as well as senior level experts. It helps position you to compete at that same compensation and salary packages. Now, let's say you don't have networks or communities that you don't have WASTA. What do you do? So in the US market, you can definitely use LinkedIn, as well as use your alumni directory in your university or college. They help a lot, and get to know them and get to know their stories so that you can position yourself. If you work in an industry like mine where you need to show a portfolio of your work, do that. People like to see a track record of your process, your results, as well as your outcomes.
I'm just gonna add because Ilham likes threes, let me be the third person to to just quickly say something. I can speak to the experience maybe in the finance industry, and I'm managing the intern program at BlackRock, not at BlackRock, in my group this year. So I think what Barduli said about there being opportunities in addition to challenges is important. So first thing I'll say is, still have a plan. You know, I think we're all still learning to learn with this new normal. You know, I hate saying that. We're all learning to live with it, or we're also things are slowly going back to the way they were. So we're trying to run our internship program to what it was previously as much as possible. Obviously, that's more challenging, but for example, I can tell you the JP Morgans and the Goldman Sachs of the world have gone back to their normal internship program. So still have, you know, your hierarchy of preferences and priorities. Second, what Ahmed said about using it to your advantage, I think that definitely works. So our internship program is actually a bit shorter this year because of the pandemic, and it's fully remote. So if you want to use that opportunity to, like you said, do more than one thing, 100% go for it. If you're working remotely and you have some downtime that in the office you wouldn't have been able to work on a bit more research at college on, do that. If you have some downtime to maybe do a second internship during the second half of the summer without killing yourself, do that. I think there are a lot of opportunities created from these unprecedented circumstances that you can leverage to your advantage. Yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you, Khalid. I actually experienced that. I felt like I had more time when I was working from home than when compared to the time I would be in office, because more people will like come and chat, longer meetings, and so on. Any other questions from the audience? I'll just give it a minute. Okay, if not, feel free to, I mean, Ilham is sharing her contact info. Feel free to contact her if you have further questions. But for now, I would like to thank the panelists today. Thank you for taking the time, Khalid, Sarah, and Ilham. I thought it was very informative, and I hope the audience have gained from this session. and we look forward to more sessions in the future with you guys. So thank you all, and good night, good day, I guess, to Ilham. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for organizing. Bye.